enjoying myself very much.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
I hope it's everything very serious. Everything you envision. With everything across.
We haven't seen something real stages.
Yeah.
We're running a hard floor.
I'm still. Good. How's Jim? We have fun.
So you're gonna lower a launch? One more part. Some.
Yeah, we have our
But I mean, yeah, the Times quote was about the whole of our top of the area. So good morning. Good to see you. So how's it? Kissinger Center next door to you. Relocated from where you've been in there were landing teams, but then the teams were jumbled in the field.
I didn't say.
Sure. I'll start watching the
Were you given the DOD?
Yes, I remember our email list. Yeah, but the video, we don't know
Right, yeah. If they fight, yeah, I should say to people, this is a
Good morning, everybody. We're going to have our first session this morning dealing with how to deal with Putin. We'll take a short break after that, and then we're going to have a roundtable discussion for an hour or an hour and a half to wrap up to see what types of insights or lessons we can extrapolate from the last 2 days. Want to thank everybody again. We've had really a terrific day and a half so far. We hope this panel doesn't let us down. A lot of responsibility for us.
No pressure.
Yeah.
But we look good.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn this over now to Eric Edelman, who's going to chair and moderate this session. As almost everybody here knows, Eric is a former ambassador to Finland and to Turkey, a former advisor to Secretary of State Schultz, to Strobe Talbot when he was Deputy Secretary, to Dick Cheney when he was Vice President, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the last couple of years of the George W. Bush administration. But most of all, we all value Eric because he's a former policymaker who really knows history and reads more history than most of us and can engage us in incredibly thoughtful ways. So we thought he'd be a fantastic person to moderate this session based on both his practical experience and his historical knowledge. So, Eric, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Mel, thank you very much. It's great to be here at the Miller Center again, and congratulations to you and Will for putting together, I think, a terrific conference. I think yesterday set an enormously high standard. I'm hoping that we will continue to maintain that standard this morning. And thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I don't have a whole lot to really say from my 30-year Foreign Service career, but I can say one thing definitively. I am the only person who worked twice for Dick Cheney and twice for Strobe Talbot. We do have a very distinguished panel here, and I'm really pleased to be in this company because the folks who are sitting up here are all people I've known and worked with over the years. Derek Cholet to my left, like Mel and Frank Castigliola, had a misspent youth at Cornell, and we have common mentors, all four of us up there. I met Derek first when he was, I was in the Pentagon, and he was doing senior honors thesis at Cornell, but we managed to cross paths again as he began his own distinguished career in public service. We actually worked together with Strobe, so I'm very pleased to be here with Derek. Gene Rumer, who's at the far end, is another former colleague from government. Gene is now at Carnegie, but and I should have said Derek is now at the German Marshall Fund, where he's the vice president. But Gene is at Carnegie, but before that was the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and had previously served at State and Defense, where he and I worked together, and a distinguished scholar of Russia in his own right. Alan Lynch, Alan and I were talking just before coming up here. We first met when I was serving in the embassy in Moscow, and Alan was writing about Mikhail Gorbachev's New Thinking for the Institute of East-West Studies under the leadership of the late John Moroz. I think they came on a trip while I was there, I think in 1987 or 88. So it's great to be here with Alan, who is here at UVA and is a leading scholar of all things Russian. And then last but definitely not least, my SICE and CSBA colleague and office mate at CSBA and now occasional co-author, Hal Brands. By the way, it's a very humbling thing to be a co-author with Hal, because you're likely to discuss something together with him and put the outline together and talk about the writing assignments, and a day later he'll come and say, I had trouble sleeping last night and I wrote my part and I wrote yours too, hope you don't mind. We have an excellent panel here, and Derek, why don't we start with you?
Standard.
Yeah, well, as you wish.
Well, thanks. First, thanks to Mel and to Will and Bill Antholis and the team here at the Miller Center for putting together this terrific conference. It's really been a treat for me to be part of this and reflecting on this century of history. And I also want to thank Eric for his kind introduction and for 25 years of being a mentor and tormentor of me. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion with my fellow panelists. And as I was thinking about what I was going to say, I was thinking, my charge here is to talk about recent history, the Obama administration and its approach towards Russia and its challenges with Russia. And many of the themes that we discussed yesterday, the trade-offs between interests and values, the question of when you engage and when you resist, the role of leaders and individual leaders in the direction of a country's foreign policy, those were all questions that the Obama administration struggled with as it grappled with the challenges related to Russia during its 8 years in office. Obama's approach to Russia is certainly one of the most contested parts of his foreign policy legacy. Jeremy Surrey, in his terrific book, The Impossible Presidency, says it's the most obvious failure of President Obama's foreign policy. I think my guess would be that President Obama would say one of two of probably his biggest regrets rhetorically in terms of what he said as president about foreign policy. One would have been calling ISIS the JV team. The other would have been his pretty glib dismissal of Mitt Romney's criticism of his Russia policy during the 2012 campaign. And also by President Obama's own sort of standard he set for himself, which is, as president, you're a relay racer and you inherit a situation from your predecessor and you have 4 to 8 years to do as much as you can, make as much progress, and then you turn over something to your successor and you hope that is as positive of a trajectory as possible. I think he would admit that the Russia relationship was not a handoff that he's particularly happy with. So, how did we get here? And I'm going to focus my remarks on the reset, talk about 5 things. What the reset was, why the reset. Second, what did it achieve? And to the extent it achieved anything, why? Third, when did the reset end and why? Fourth, given the dismal state of U.S. Russian relations today, could things have been different? And finally, what this means moving forward. So first, how we got here. Why the reset? And I think it's important to remember where it really started, which was February 2009, the first major foreign policy speech given by anyone in the administration, Vice President Biden in Munich. It's worth quoting at length. To paraphrase President Obama, Vice President Biden said, "It is time to press the reset button and reinvest in the many areas where we can and should be working together with Russia." That's what everyone remembers about Biden's speech. The second part, which is very important but is often not as widely referenced, is Biden's clarification, which is we will also not recognize any nation having a sphere of influence. It will remain our view that sovereign states have the right to make their own decisions and choose their own alliances. So the mindset of the Obama administration when it came into office was that there had been a lot of scar tissue built up in the U.S.-Russian relationship for a lot of good reasons during the Bush years, and that for those reasons we were unable to see some opportunities that were before us, and that we, in some senses, needed Russia to achieve certain policy goals that the administration had on nuclear security, on Afghanistan, on Iran. So the sense of resetting the relationship, of improving relationship, was always very explicitly a means. It was not an end. And I quote in my paper a transition document from the Obama transition, where it was made very explicit. The end is not to just have a good relationship with Russia. The end is to achieve some goals, and our relationship with Russia is critical to achieving those goals. So it was, to a certain extent, transactional, and it was very pragmatic. And there was also a sense that there was an opportunity because the president of Russia at the time was not Vladimir Putin. It was Medvedev. Now, everyone knew that Putin was behind the scenes and still pulling the strings, but the view was, let's test this with Medvedev. So that's what the administration set out to do. Now, what did the reset achieve? And to the extent it achieved anything, why did it work? I think that if you look at the first term of the Obama administration, there were some very tangible accomplishments that were meaningful to President Obama's larger foreign policy goals. Opening up the Northern Distribution Network into Afghanistan to help the resupply of U.S. troops there, which then reduced our reliance on Pakistan. The New START Treaty, reduction of nuclear weapons. Of course, the Iran sanctions, critical piece of Obama's Iran diplomacy, was getting those tough sanctions, and Russia was a necessary partner there. And even in ways that we didn't expect and that then swung back to haunt us. So, for example, the willingness of Russia to abstain in the UN Security Council on the Libya intervention, which was the first time a Kremlin leader had allowed the UN Security Council to move forward on a humanitarian intervention, and I think probably the last time, at least for quite a while, that a Kremlin leader would allow that. That was unexpected. But so then why did it work? I mean, to the extent we got these things done, how did that happen? First, I think clearly there were overlapping interests. I mean, this was not brilliant diplomacy alone. I think whether it's President Obama or Biden or Clinton or others deserve credit, but Russia had an interest in working with us to curb Iran's nuclear program. I think that there was no question that Medvedev mattered quite a bit. In Obama's first term, one of his closest, or I shouldn't say closest, but one of his more favorite interlocutors was Medvedev. They were very similar in outlook. They're both young lawyers. They both sort of fashioned themselves as modern leaders, and they got along quite well. The president had very minimal interaction with Vladimir Putin during his first term before Putin returned to the presidency. And that was interaction that wouldn't surprise anyone here. It was very scratchy, very difficult. But so the focus was on Medvedev. And what's interesting is I reflect on what the U.S. achieved from the reset period is that it was able to get these things with very little, with giving very little. In that sense, it wasn't much of a transaction because there wasn't much that the U.S. conceded to get New START or the Northern Distribution Network in Afghanistan or Iran sanctions. So then when did the reset end and why? Well, first, why? I think in part that period ended because we had achieved most of our main goals. the agenda in U.S.-Russian relations wasn't as robust. We had to maintain the Iran sanctions. We had to, of course, implement the New START deal, but there was nothing big we were trying to achieve with them. And I put this around 2012 is the period. So the fewer projects. Secondly, no question, Libya and the Arab Spring was a massive period of turbulence in the U.S.-Russian relationship. Of course, the way Libya went down, I think, was one of the reasons why Putin decided to come back. There are many reasons, but I think that's certainly one, and he felt that Medvedev made a very bad decision in allowing that UN Security Council vote to go forward. Certainly, the Arab Spring, the impact of the Arab Spring on the mentality inside Russia, and particularly Putin's head, of the colored revolutions coming to him, and this was him seeing the U.S. is behind of all of this, which helps explain some of the timing. I mean, there's no question that I think the reset died when Putin came back into power in May of 2012. It was in the wake of the Arab Spring, and by the end of that year, you had protests on the streets of Russia that, of course, Putin was blaming Hillary Clinton for fomenting. U.S. domestically, we had the Magnitsky Act, the sanctions passed by the Congress and signed by the president at the end of that year. So basically, by the end of 2012, the reset was over. And I think that President Obama was very aware, I know that he was very aware, that Putin was going to be a different kind of character. I think in retrospect, one of the things he got wrong, and many of us got wrong, was that there was a belief that because Putin was in fact always the power behind the scenes during the Medvedev period, that he was more on board with the reset achievements than he actually was. And so that it would be a different tone in the relationship, but I think there was an expectation by President Obama that turned out to be wrong, that there would be more continuity than discontinuity. So I actually think an interesting question for Russia watchers, to me, is what explains the Medvedev period? I mean, because it certainly was a different tone out of Russia. There was a lot of differences still, but the U.S.-Russian relationship was relatively harmonious. And so what explains that on the Russian side? So post-2013, the U.S.-Russian relationship hit the skids, was spiraling downwards. The only example of cooperation, which was an important one, was the cooperation to remove Syrian chemical weapons after the Red Line episode in fall of 2013 and into 2014. But by early 2014 and the Maidan protests and Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, the relationship basically went into the deep freeze and is still in that place today. Sanctions, NATO deployments in Eastern Europe, a new relationship with Ukraine with significant military assistance and training. We've basically been in the same place with Russia since early 2014. So now, given the dismal state of the relationship, what could have been different? Well, I don't want to give back any of the reset achievements. I mean, when I look at what the U.S. gained from the reset period on Afghanistan or Iran or nuclear security, those all served our interests and still serve those interests today. So the question is, what could the administration have done differently? I do think that it's fair to say there was a policy failure in that, first, as I noted, that there was an expectation of greater continuity. Second, that there were missed opportunities for the United States to respond more forcefully, particularly as things spiraled in 2014. President Obama was very, very worried about escalation. His strategic outlook on Russia was famously, Russia's not 10 feet tall. They're a regional power with a strong military. So let's not get ourselves into a fight that would not serve our larger interests. So when it came to questions of lethal assistance to Ukraine or how to ratchet up the sanctions, he was very, very focused on the escalation dynamic and believed that Putin, in those cases, had escalation dominance. So he was very careful in how he decided to deploy American power. I personally think that he could have played a little more with risk. I'm happy to get into that in the Q&A, but I think that there was probably less of a risk of escalation. And I'd be interested in when his book comes out in a few years, what he will say about that, whether he thinks in retrospect he had a little more maneuver room than he thought at the time. But in addition to a policy failure, there was no question there was an analytical failure. I don't think the intelligence community writ large, nor did policymakers appreciate Putin's penchant for risk-taking. No one was predicting inside the government that he was going to take Crimea. And I also think it's also very true, obviously, that the United States government and the strategic community writ large did not have a handle, and really still to this day does not have a handle on the asymmetric threat. Part of that is the U.S. government is not well organized to understand and focus intensely on these social media issues, and certainly it's an IC shortcoming. It's also something, as we're learning, the private sector doesn't fully have a grasp of what's exactly happening, and they're learning on the fly. And I think the administration also thought of this primarily as a cybersecurity threat. So when it came to Russian interference in the 2016 election, the warnings that the Obama administration actually made, publicly or privately, were focused mainly on the security of election machines. That wasn't on the social media aspect. So what does this mean for today? I have a pretty pessimistic outlook of the near term here for U.S.-Russian relations. I think my lessons from the reset period is one of the biggest mistakes of the reset, even though I wouldn't give back the policy achievements, was overselling it. No question, Secretary Clinton regrets the whole button, gimmick for a lot of reasons. Namely, the mistranslation was probably one. But I don't think at this moment we can exaggerate the potential of the U.S.-Russian relationship. Presidents are better off under-promising and over-delivering. Second, my experience is, I've come away from my experience saying we shouldn't chase the Russians. I was reflecting, Strobe, when you were talking yesterday, that in many ways I think the period of partnership, we were trying to bring Russia in as a partner where we could solve all sorts of problems together, that really ended in 2014. And I mean, it ended in a practical way, for example, at the Pentagon, where I was working at the time, where we brought the curtain down on all of our earnest efforts to build mill-mill ties and find these projects we could work on together. The Russians were never really interested in it. We were far more interested than they were, and they would humor us by attending our meetings. But they weren't really interested at that moment in a genuine dialogue or partnership. So don't exaggerate the potential, don't chase. And I think also in terms of our aspirations, to recognize that there is just currently less policy space for genuine cooperation anyway. It goes back to why I think the reset slowed down, is because the United States needed Russia less. So even if we think about selective partnership, it's a lot more selective, because there's just not that many issues where we need Russia's cooperation. We need to stop Russia from being a disruptor of the international system, a disruptor of our partners and allies on its periphery, a disruptor of our politics. But it's hard to see areas where Russia at this moment, and I think as long as Putin's in power, I think this will remain the case, hard to see areas where they can be a constructive partner. The danger and the problem for our current moment is, I think, that the Trump administration, President Trump personally, is vulnerable to doing the exact opposite, right? He's going to chase the Russians. He exaggerates the potential of everything. He's certainly exaggerating the potential of this relationship. And he misreads the possibilities for what U.S.-Russian partnership can bring in the future. So with that, I'll turn it over. Thank you.
Alan? Thank you. If the microphone works, I'll stay here. Is it all right? Yes? Okay. Let me just flag one question that occurred to me at the very end of Derek's very interesting presentation, and I'm not going to comment on it, but just note it out there later for conversation. And the question is simply this: if it's true that there are very few areas where cooperation with Russia can solve Central American interests, consider the following question. Can Ukraine be stabilized without Russia's agreement? Can Ukraine be stabilized without Russian cooperation? So we can come back to that later. In my paper, I make an argument as to why every effort to reset U.S.-Russian relations after the Cold War has failed. The basic argument is that a series of major asymmetries or imbalances in the basic structure of the relationship, combined with incompatible policy objectives about the status of Russia's post-Soviet borderlands, have combined to frustrate the attempts of both Russian and American leaders alike to develop a stable and productive relationship. Now, even if policy objectives were more closely aligned than they have been, the gaping imbalances in the basic characteristics of the relationship would still serve to complicate the establishment of a new détente. Likewise, if the relationship were more symmetrical in nature, the differences in policy and definitions of core interests would still not be simple to reconcile. But as it happens, the combination of major structural imbalances and policy differences raises enormously high political bar in terms of the political capital needed in both Washington and Moscow to move relations forward. What are these structural, and I would argue structuring, asymmetries in the American-Russian relationship? Power, focus, values, memory, and economics. Power, very simple. If the Soviet economy was about a third the size of the American economy, the Russian economy is about an eighth the size of the American economy, and that doesn't take into account America's allies. Focus. The American focus is global. The Russian focus, unlike the Soviet focus, is not global, but is intensely regional. All you have to do is look at a map of American military bases around the world. More than 180 bases in almost as many countries of various kinds. Russia has one set of military facilities outside the borders of the former Soviet Union. That's in Syria, inherited from the Soviet Union. Focus, also, Derek mentioned the reset button. But there were two mistakes in that reset button. Not just the linguistic mistake of mistranslating reset as overburden. But even if we're correct, it was written in the Latin alphabet, not the Cyrillic. How could that have happened? It never could have happened during the Cold War, because there would have been structures of review over such a consideration because of the greater focus and centrality of Soviet power and the way it disciplined American power and American policy. Values, we don't need to discuss very much. Just think about the ways in which events like the Pussy Riot incident, Putin's laws on homosexuality, his views of modernity or post-modernity have had the effect, remarkably in the United States now, of creating a left-wing opposition to Russia as well as a right-wing. So that now the anti-Russian reflexes are default throughout the American political system. Memory. The 1990s, we've discussed this. I was teaching yesterday afternoon, so I missed the afternoon discussion. But for many Americans, the 1990s is a story of well-intentioned efforts to bring Russia into the liberal international economic and political community. For most Russians, especially those without foreign passports, it's the third time of troubles. After the early 1600s, the Russian Civil War, and the Russian 1990s. And Putin exploits that sensibility very effectively to reinforce his legitimacy. Those memories are incompatible. And finally, economics. Trade is so low, there are simply too few stakeholders in the relationship. U.S. trade last year with China was $577 billion two-way. With Canada, $543 billion two-way. With the Netherlands, $55 billion two-way. With Russia, $20 billion and falling. All right. Compare the difference in terms of the vested stake of a whole series of interest groups inside the government and in the business community when we look at U.S.-China relations versus U.S. Russia relations. And then there is the profound difference, aside from these structural characteristics, in basic policy assumptions and definition of interests. Derek quoted Joe Biden from the Munich conference in February. In July, just after the Moscow summit, he said, I believe it was in Georgia, which is on the list for NATO admission, quote, I think we vastly underestimate the hand we hold. And it was connected to this notion of spheres of influence, not to be allowed to Russia, or anyone, except one country. Now, of most concern for the Russian government is that the U.S. government has consistently denied what Russia deems, rightly or wrongly, a vital national interest. That is, a recognized sphere of influence along its borderlands. So long as countries like Georgia and Ukraine remain eligible for NATO membership, Moscow cannot assume that it can provide for its security at the negotiating table with Washington. Such a framework of analysis, I would submit, helps us understand why Putin would have taken the decision, the risky decision, to interfere in the 2016 U.S. presidential elections. Why did he do it? Not to help elect Donald Trump. How could Putin, a self-styled realist, have thought that Trump ever had a realistic chance of winning? I find nothing in Putin's biography or record in power that supports the idea that he would take major risks for such an improbability. Rather, Putin fully expected that Hillary Clinton would be the next president. Given the unraveling of the Obama reset since 2011, and by the way, the Libyan episode is the first episode in 2011, the election controversy is at the end of 2011, while Clinton is still Secretary of State, December of 2011. Putin had grounds for thinking that a President Hillary Clinton would launch a new campaign of pressure on Putin's government and Putin's clients in the name of human rights and democratization. Clinton herself states in her memoir that Putin had it in for her ever since she publicly scolded him and his machine for the manipulated parliamentary elections of December 2011. There was also the Libyan intervention that Derek mentioned, in which Clinton was a major promoter of what turned out to be, in spite of explicit assurances to the Russian government to the contrary, what turned out to be regime change and de facto assassination. The progressive collapse of the reset through 2012 and 2013, before the onset of the Ukraine crisis, reinforced the idea that there was little, if anything, that Moscow could hope for, and perhaps there was more even to fear from Washington and a Clinton presidency, which from Putin's point of view would be equivalent to Obama's third term in office. Try to imagine the reaction in Moscow to perhaps a third statement that President Obama might regret having made. October of 2014, in which President Obama identified the three vital threats to America's interests: Ebola, ISIS, and Russia. Well, what do you do with Ebola? You eradicate it. What do you do with ISIS? You annihilate it. But what do you do with Russia? I'll leave it to your imaginations, how the Russian leaders react to that. Additionally, and admittedly it's circumstantial evidence, the idea that Putin was trying to neutralize an expected Clinton presidency rather than to elect Trump. Recall, the FBI warned the Democratic National Committee in September of 2015 that it was likely that their servers were being hacked. This was long before anyone seriously thought of Donald Trump as a plausible candidate for the Republican nomination, not to mention President of the United States. By the way, John Podesta's password for his Windows 8 operating system, it wasn't password because Google won't allow that. It was P*SSW0RD. I dare say 2 or 3 of us in this room with one of our IT specialists probably could figure out how to get into that system without too much trouble. So it wasn't necessarily the Russians. Are we thinking that WikiLeaks, it was beyond the capacity of WikiLeaks alone to penetrate such a shield? I'm not saying the Russians weren't involved, but they may not have been the only ones. From this point of view, then, Russian interference was designed to propagate maximum possible embarrassment about the American political system, to expose American double standards and thereby blunt an expected full-court press by a future Clinton administration on Russia in the name of democracy and human rights. That, given the evaporation of hope for the future of relations with Washington, that was a stake worth taking risks for. The stupefying irony, of course, is that with Trump elected, Russia's interference ensures that there could be no reset for the long foreseeable future. In sum, we cannot understand the incentives framing Russia's electoral interference without mapping out how the Russians themselves understood the trajectory of American-Russian relations, not just since 2011, but for most of the post-Cold War period as well. All right, so to close with the connection to the present and immediate future. There's a general rule in American political science, and I think Vlad Zubak mentioned it on the first day. There's a sweet spot in about 2 years into a president's term where there's a kind of an optimal combination of political capital, which is slowly declining after his election, but foreign policy experience, which is slowly increasing, and with maximum distance from electoral accountability, you have a window for flexibility in foreign policy. But in Donald Trump's case, not only was his political capital unusually low, having lost the popular vote by 3 million, but, shall we say, his foreign policy experience was also unusually limited upon assuming office. 6 months into his administration already, his Russia policy was dead in the water. In March, Putin made a confidential initiative to engineer another reset in the relationship. It was quickly suffocated in Trump's own Republican national security bureaucracy. Congress in July voted a sanctions policy, which removes it out of the executive branch and into the Congress. The president may not lift sanctions on Russia without congressional assent, even though Obama imposed them by executive order. And the Mueller investigation, just see the Manafort indictment as the most recent instance, hangs like the sword of Damocles over the head of the Trump administration. It's thus very hard for me to see how, after the midterms, whatever the results, there could emerge a U.S. political coalition for dealing with Moscow. As a result, Putin has almost nothing to hope for and perhaps nothing to fear from Washington for the foreseeable future. That, I think, is a dangerous combination, suggesting that the focus of American policy should be to avoid the worst rather than to achieve the best. Items to consider, they won't be terribly controversial: deepening collaboration between the U.S. and Russian air commands in Syria to avoid accidents in the air and on the ground, rethinking the pattern of military deployments and exercises along the Russian NATO borderlands, which have too frequently assumed hair-trigger dimensions in the past 3 years, maintaining the tenuous bond with Russia and China in dealing with North Korea's nuclear issue and ambitions, and finally, broadening confidential dialogue among officials, civilians, and military in and out of the government. Perhaps at no point since the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis have Russians and Americans been less interested in actually listening to each other. If the overwhelming majority of American leaders mean what they say, that is, there could be no real improvement in U.S.-Russian relations while Putin is in power, this is likely the most that can be achieved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. Hal.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thanks to the organizer of the conference for having me here. So my remarks are based on a paper which starts from the blindingly obvious premise that U.S.-Russian relations are worse today than they have been at any time since the end of the Cold War, and probably at any time since the really dangerous years of the early 1980s. So we've seen crises and confrontations become more the norm than the exception. The rhetoric in both capitals has turned increasingly hostile. And as Alan mentioned, there seemed briefly to be a possibility of some type of rapprochement when Donald Trump took office, but just as rapidly that prospect vanished, and really in the weeks thereafter. And so this means that the next few years are probably going to be a difficult passage in U.S.-Russian relations as we try to grapple with what I think most U.S. policymakers see as a renewed Russian threat to U.S. interests and to the broader international order. But if the future of U.S.-Russia relations is going to be difficult, it's not unknown territory in the sense that we now have nearly 2 decades of experience in dealing both with Vladimir Putin himself and with the Putinist system and foreign policy that he has constructed. And so my remarks will briefly offer 5 lessons, I think, that can be drawn from those dealings and that can perhaps inform U.S. policy in the years ahead. And so, in other words, my remarks will be less focused on the granular history of any particular aspect of U.S.-Russia relations in this period, as was the case with Derek's remarks, for instance, and more on an attempt to distill what I see as the geopolitical insights we can take away from this period writ large. And this collection of lessons is not meant to be exhaustive or definitive, and my guess is that reasonable people can probably disagree about both the underlying history here and some of the policy implications that I extrapolate therefrom. And so I offer these points basically as provocations in hopes of generating debate. So the first point, and I think in some ways the most obvious one, is that the United States just needs to recognize, frankly, what it's up against. And this is something that I think is relevant just because of the nature of the dialogue over Russia we saw in the 2016 campaign. The tensions between the United States and Russia today are not rooted in some geopolitical misunderstanding or some personality clash that can easily be corrected, as I think Donald Trump sometimes implied during his campaign. Those tensions are rooted primarily, in my view, in just a deep-seated clash between America's desire to preserve and expand the liberal international order on the one hand, and the desire of Russian policymakers, primarily but not exclusively Putin, to revise, resist, and undermine that order on the other hand. I think that Putin himself has been telling us this pretty explicitly since about 2007. We saw it at his speech in Munich in that year. We saw it at his appearance at the UN General Assembly in 2015. And he's been telling us this with even greater force in his policies, from the invasion of Georgia to the invasion of Ukraine to the intervention in Syria to the ongoing efforts to undermine NATO and the EU and even to meddle in Western political processes. And so I think, simply put, it's become increasingly clear that Russian leaders, namely Putin, view the maintenance and expansion of an American-led world order based on American dominance and the spread of Western institutions as a threat to Russian security, a threat to Russian political stability, a threat to Russia's ability to influence the nations, particularly along its own periphery. And so as Russia has increasingly regained the ability to push back against that encroachment, both real and perceived, over the past decade, it has done so. And I think, as Derek rightly mentioned, there have been some Russian leaders who are less influenced by this essentially zero-sum mindset, Medvedev namely. And there have undoubtedly been ways in which misperceptions and personality quirks and electoral politics have exacerbated the state of U.S.-Russian relations. But I think fundamentally what we have today is a clash between two powers that just have very different political systems and very different views of what makes for a just and desirable international order. And this leads to a second lesson, which I think echoes points that both Derek and Alan made, which is that there is no grand bargain to be had between the U.S. and Russia today, or at least there's no grand bargain to be had at a reasonable price. In fact, I think one of the things we've repeatedly learned over the past 15 years is that it is a mistake to see tactical or transactional cooperation as a prelude to broader strategic rapprochement. This isn't to say that the Obama-era reset or even the Bush-era engagement with Putin teaches us that we should avoid diplomatic engagement or cooperation with Russia. I think there actually was quite productive transactional cooperation that came out of the reset, for instance, on all the issues that Derek mentioned, and I think there's the imperative of cooperation on a narrower but not null set of issues today. But I do think that the lesson of these earlier periods is that we shouldn't give in to the illusion that in the near term at least, discrete cooperation with Russia on any single subject will be anything more than compartmentalized and transactional, precisely because the core ideological and geopolitical cleavages are so deep. And I think that this is something that George Bush learned toward the end of his presidency when his efforts to cultivate a favorable relationship with Putin fell apart. I think this is what Obama discovered in his second term as well. And so for the time being, the United States has to keep its expectations limited. We shouldn't expect that a breakthrough or an agreement on one issue, so deconfliction or de-escalation zones in Syria, for instance, will prove to be the key that unlocks the relationship. And this leads to a third lesson, which is I think that we should actually expect things to get worse before they get better. So as I've said, I think the current hostility between the U.S. and Russia is rooted primarily in divergent worldviews and objectives, but it has frequently been exacerbated by issues like politics. And so you'll recall that Putin really ramped up the anti-American rhetoric and policies when he faced a surprisingly strong challenge to his rule and to his reelection in 2011-2012, as Alan mentioned. And since then, he has increasingly used anti-Americanism as a source of political legitimacy at home. And so I don't think we can exclude the possibility that as we get closer to the Russian presidential election in March 2018, that we should expect to see more of the same from Putin. A fourth lesson is, particularly from dealing with Putin, is that we should expect the unexpected, in the sense that Putin's risk tolerance and his propensity to undertake daring initiatives or fait accompli has repeatedly proven higher than U.S. and Western observers have anticipated. The first time we saw this, of course, was in Georgia in 2008. We've subsequently seen similar tendencies in Ukraine in 2014, in Syria in 2015, in the meddling in U.S. and other elections in 2016, and other instances. And in each of these cases, Putin demonstrated a willingness to pursue quite risky courses of action, policies that he might well have expected would expose Russia to significant diplomatic and economic costs when he perceives either an imperative or an opening. And so this doesn't mean that Putin cannot be deterred in the future. It doesn't mean that all of these gambles have paid strategic as opposed to simply tactical dividends for Russia. I think you can certainly make the case that the intervention in Ukraine backfired by leaving Russia far more isolated than before. And I also think that it's quite clear, so far at least, that Putin has been far more reluctant to press for advantage in areas where American red lines are more clearly drawn. So he understands, I think, that Estonia is not Georgia, Poland is not Ukraine, and so on and so forth. But what all this does mean is that Putin is a natural risk taker, that he's willing to move boldly when he thinks he can catch adversaries flat-footed, and that we underestimate those characteristics at our peril. And so these first four lessons put me firmly in the same camp with Derek and Alan in terms of thinking that there's really not a whole lot of hope for a dramatic improvement of U.S.-Russian relations so long as Putin and Putinism are guiding Russian policy. Now, it's possible that you could have more productive diplomacy, an improvement of overall relations a few years down the line. But this is my fifth and final point, is that I think we need to recognize that any type of this diplomacy, particularly on core security issues, will work better when it's conducted from a position of strength. And this is a lesson not just from the Putin years. I think this is a lesson from the longer history of U.S.-Russian and U.S.-Soviet relations. I think certainly this was the key to the successful negotiation of arms control deals in the 1980s, for instance. But conversely, where the facts on the ground have favored Moscow in recent years, so in Ukraine since 2014, in Syria since 2015, diplomatic negotiations with the Russians have generally proven frustrating and unrewarding. Now, I'm not saying here that the United States needs to escalate every confrontation with Russia in order to gain the upper hand, but it does mean, I think, that we would be well advised to use the next few years, a time in which I don't think there's going to be a meaningful breakthrough in U.S.-Russia relations, to arrange the geopolitical chessboard in ways that might ultimately advance successful diplomacy. And so if we want to bring Russia back into compliance with the INF Treaty, for instance, I think we should start funding research and development of our own intermediate range delivery systems that could be deployed if Russia refuses. If we want a new strategic arms deal with the Russians, we need to demonstrate that the alternative is the modernization of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. If we want to negotiate some agreement on cyberspace, for instance, I think we need to demonstrate that we can otherwise defend ourselves and impose costs on Moscow in that realm. And so I'll just close by actually echoing one of Eric's favorite quotes, and this is from George Kennan, who I think knew the history of relations between Washington and Moscow as well as anybody. And he said, quote, "You have no idea how much it contributes to the general politeness and pleasantness of diplomacy when you have a little quiet armed force in the background." The point is that diplomacy can't succeed without leverage. And so as we think about the future of the relationship with Russia, I think we would do well to keep that in mind. Thanks.
Thanks, Hal. Gene.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for the exceedingly generous introduction earlier. And thank you to Mel and Will for including me in this conversation. It's really a privilege and a pleasure, and it's rare to encounter so much historical knowledge and intellectual firepower in one room, and I've really learned a lot and benefited from the conversation yesterday and the day before. And it's a reminder to me personally, really, how much I don't know, how much I have yet to learn, and really how sorely missed the historical perspective is in many of our conversations about our national priorities and our foreign policy. So, notwithstanding the great accomplishments of the people in this room and the Miller Center and other universities, your work is not done. There's still a lot to do. And incidentally, I was listening to the fascinating conversation yesterday, and it occurred to me that probably I'd be willing to bet, I don't know, $50. A similar conversation is not taking place in Moscow these days. I cannot imagine a conversation in Moscow about, are there any missed opportunities in the past 4 years that we want to look at and say, we really shouldn't have done that? We shouldn't have interfered with the election. And Al and I do believe that they interfered in the election.
I do too.
Was that a mistake? I just can't imagine that. So if I'm wrong, I'd be delighted to be proven wrong. As I sort of approached the task given to me by Mel, I knew from get-go that I would not have any answers. I agree with everyone who said here that the relationship was in a very bad place, but I don't know what the answer is to improving it. I think we're in this for quite a long time. And as I look back at the relationship over the past 25 years or so, there is a remarkable pattern repeating itself. My fellow speakers on this panel have noted that the relationship is at its worst since the end of the Cold War. But the same thing could have been said in 2008 when President Obama was taking over the relationship from President Bush. And the same thing could have been said in 2000 when President Bush took over the management of the relationship from President Clinton. There's been this pattern of going in cycles or going in circles in this relationship, and I've tried to think of, what really defines our approach to Russia in the past 25 years since the end of the Cold War, and there's been, despite the ideological and political differences in the three administrations that comprised the bulk of that period, there's been a remarkable consistency in the way they have approached Russia and dealt with it through thick and thin. After, again, I was not a participant in policy making in the 1990s, so my knowledge is drawn from memoirs of participants, so on. I think after the immediate task of consolidating, at least setting the framework for consolidating the Soviet Union's nuclear legacy, which you remember was scattered across many republics of the former Soviet Union. After that was taken care of, after the non-Lugar framework was put in place, the policy really focused on three basic elements. I should say also after providing the much-needed emergency assistance to avoid what was expected to be really a dire situation in many parts of the former Soviet Union. The policy settled into, three basic elements. And they're not necessarily in the order of priorities, they're sort of complementary. There was, of course, an effort to pursue domestic change and transform Russia into a market economy and a democratic political system, some kind of pluralistic political system. There was a very deliberate effort to keep Russia from reacquiring its lost empire. The anti-neo-imperialist, pardon the long word, sort of theme in American policy throughout the past 25 years has been very, very strong. And then beginning with the mid-1990s, it's the expansion of the Euro-Atlantic security architecture, NATO enlargement, and subsequently EU enlargement as the third principal element of this policy. And this really has been the basic framework of the way we have dealt with Russia. And I should say, perhaps jumping a bit ahead, but also repeating what my colleagues on this panel have said, all three of those elements have been soundly rejected by Russia. Just to give a few examples of what was being pursued, there was, of course, early on a conversation about NATO enlargement in the Clinton administration and Partnership for Peace, perhaps expected by the Russians to be a substitute for NATO enlargement, but then very clearly it was a supplement rather than a substitute, perceived by the Russian security establishment as a way for the United States to put its tentacles around the Russian periphery. I don't know if some of you recall, for example, the establishment of Centras-Bat, a combined Central Asian battalion of several countries that were willing to participate. And now largely forgotten, but Russians still remember the episode when a four-star Marine general, General Sheen, led a parachute jump into Kazakhstan and proudly said that we can now plant the American flag in the heart of Eurasia. There was an effort again to build a series of pipelines. Remember when I was working at the State Department in the 1990s, there was, or late 90s, there wasn't a week or a month perhaps when there was, when somewhere in Washington there wasn't a conference about Caspian pipelines. But the pipelines were supposed to go not through Russia, but in the east-west direction, bypassing Russia. Again, this was not necessarily seen in Russia as a friendly, positive gesture. And then, of course, in terms of domestic support for reform in Russia, there was the deployment or the parachuting of the IRI and the NDI, which were driven by the best of intentions. But again, as some speakers yesterday have noted, this was not particularly welcomed by many Russians, certainly in the Russian political establishment. So, you know, by the end of the 1990s, again, you have the souring of the relationship, and other factors, of course, come into play, such as the campaign in the Balkans, which, again, was being viewed through a very negative prism by the Russian establishment, rejected as NATO unilateralism and something that the threat that Russia could possibly face if it remained weak and if it accepted the hegemony of the United States and its Western allies. So you have, of course, by the end of the 1990s, the relationship in its worst shape since the Cold War. And then, of course, the Bush administration takes over, and it's basically pursuing more or less the same set of policies, perhaps under a new label. There was the emphasis on democracy promotion. There was continued emphasis on expanding NATO. Georgia and Ukraine jump on the list of NATO candidates. Of course, many here in this room know better what happened in 2007, 2008 in the Bucharest summit, when the two were basically given a promise to join the alliance eventually. None of this really triggers, from what I could tell, still can tell based on what we know, any reassessment on the part of U.S. Foreign policymakers of the approach to Russia. Basically, Russia will have to either accept it or not, but we're moving forward. I remember very clearly conversations with some colleagues in the Defense Department about, for example, dealings with Central Asian states when senior officials basically said, look, there's no need to talk to Russia about our policy towards Central Asia. Well, we found out later on in 2009, when we wanted to build a northern distribution network, that Russia played a reasonably important role in facilitating that transit. So again, there is not really a different approach there or any question marks about what needed to be done, perhaps differently. And of course, you have the culmination of that with the war against Georgia, the crushing of Georgia. And once again, the relationship is at its worst since the end of the Cold War. Derek, I think, covered very well the Obama years. And I share his view that the reset was a wise and well-advised policy, and it was necessary to pursue it. But again, there were elements within the approach to Russia besides the reset that basically continued the same line. Don't remember that a big part of modernization was domestic political modernization that we hoped Medvedev would implement. One of the breaking points was in the winter of 2011-2012, when the administration came out rather strongly against Russian government action and the likelihood, almost the certainty at the time, basically, that Putin would return to the Kremlin and retake the charge of the relationship. So you have sort of this repeated pattern that I was looking for a label for it, and it really looks like containment light. Containment because it's, no empire, the expansion of a security architecture that Russia doesn't accept, and domestic change. The light part really is because it was not accompanied by a serious military buildup. If anything, it's the kind of withdrawal of American military presence from Europe, which is primarily the theater that the Russians are concerned about. So, again, borrowing the phrase from the conversation yesterday, Trump, putting aside all the problems that we all know about with his campaign and so on, Trump against this background appears perhaps as the heroic leader who had, whether he knew it or not, I don't know, but the intent to single-handedly move the relationship in a very different direction and put it in a very different place. Not necessarily beneficial to U.S. interest as I see it. I want to be very clear about that. But, he was prepared to disregard the swamp or the blob, however you describe the foreign policy establishment, the experts. But again, he was basically thwarted, as others have pointed out on this panel, in that. So now we are where we are. I think, ironically, the Trump election was the best chance we had at a different relationship with Russia, at the price, as I see it, of compromising, giving up some of the key pillars of American foreign policy that I don't think was acceptable. And it proved to be unacceptable to our foreign policy establishment community at large. We are where we are. We're set on the same course. The Wall Street Journal reported last night that the administration has decided in principle to send lethal assistance to Ukraine, although the timeline for that is not yet clear. That is bound to escalate tensions with Russia. So we seem to be on this track for the foreseeable future. I should say that, this is not a unique problem in our foreign policy where we try to do the same thing over and over and over again. We're disappointed with the results, but we keep trying. Cuba is one example, Iran is another example, arguably North Korea is a third example, but there are many others. I think we're stuck. Just to end this on on a somewhat optimistic note, I would say that, one, our ability to predict the course of the relationship in the next 4 or 8 years really has been quite dismal. The community at large did not predict the breakup of the Soviet Union until it was quite late. We did not predict that a Putin-like leader would emerge in the wake of Boris Yeltsin's departure. We did not predict the Georgian war. We did not predict the invasion of Ukraine and so on. So perhaps we're wrong. Perhaps, history doesn't follow the linear path. Maybe there'll be something there that could radically change the course of the relationship for the better. But I don't know what it is right now, so thank you.
Bob, did you have an interjection you wanted to make? I had a couple of comments I was going to make. And
Just when you're willing to take.
okay, well, we'll start. I promise we'll start with you and then with Philip. Those were 4 terrific presentations, which is what I expected. If they suffered from any defect, I think it's excessive cheeriness and optimism about the prospect for these relations. So let me just briefly, add a cautionary note. I was asked in the course of the summer to contribute to a symposium that the National Interest was putting together with the usual blob members and swamp things. I'm clearly one. Based on the proposition that are Russia and the United States, doomed to be in conflict with one another, and is it possible to reset the relationship? And my 800-word contribution to this symposium basically said what our panel members have said today, no, but I added in it's probably a good thing too, because I think to build off some of what our colleagues have said here, in terms of what the agenda would be, it largely would be Syria and Ukraine, and as several of the panelists have suggested, and I agree, in order to actually reach some kind of agreement, at least under current foreseeable circumstances, the U.S. would probably have to give up more than would be advisable, and almost certainly more than our political system is prepared to allow at this point. I'd like to focus the discussion on 3 things and just ask the 4 panelists very briefly to respond to these 3 questions, and then we'll go to Bob and Philip. The panelists obviously are all in agreement about the dismal prospects for re-engagement with Russia, certainly as long as Putin is in power. But looking back over the period, which goes back to the panels of yesterday afternoon that Bob and Philip were a part of, and that Strobe was on about the Bush and Clinton administrations, essentially since the end of the Cold War, who bears the responsibility, in your view, the bulk of the responsibility for the current pass that we are at? Is it the fault of U.S. policy, or is it the fault of Russian policy, or is it just an inevitable, tragic consequence of the failures of Russian reform and the inability of Russia to become a normal country, as some folks were discussing yesterday afternoon? Second question, when did it become inevitable that we were going to end up here? What were the key inflection or turning points? And over the course of the last 2 days, various people have suggested different ones, and I've made a list, and so I'm going to read out the list, and others may have other dates that they would like to, or events they would like to add to this. Was it doomed from the point of the 1999 apartment bombings that brought Putin to power and allowed him to create this personalistic, and someone, I think it was either Vlad or might have been Sergei yesterday, used the term, which I think is correct, neo-patrimonial system in Russia? Second, was it the Iraq War of 2003? I think one of our colleagues yesterday suggested the Iraq War of 2003 was the point at which this took a bad turn. Was it the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004? The missile defense decision, which was made in January of 2007, for which I bear some responsibility. I actually wrote the decision memo to President Bush on that one, we made the decision to put ground-based interceptors in Poland and a mid-course radar in the Czech Republic. Was it the war in Georgia in 2008? Was that when it turned irrevocably south? Derek suggested the war in Libya in 2011 and/or the parliamentary campaign of 2011. Was that the turning point? Or was it as late as 2014, the Crimean invasion? So that would be question 2. And then third, and I'm going to ask, we've been very disciplined on time so far, I'm going to ask the panelists to be disciplined in responding to these 3 very easy questions I'm putting to them. The third question is, if U.S. policy was responsible in some way, what were the real alternatives that might have been pursued that might have led to a different outcome? And by real alternatives, I mean alternatives that were not just now the product of 2020 retrospective hindsight, but were available and actually considered at the time and might have been pursued instead of the policies that were pursued. So with that very, very easy task, I start with you, Derek.
So on the first question, I don't think folks would be surprised. I think the blame principally rests with Russia. And as I think back of the 25 years, last 25 years of history, I see really starting with the George H.W. Bush administration, through Clinton, through Bush, through Obama, the basic thrust of U.S. policy was to try to find ways to cooperate with Russia, and this belief that the United States, if it just tried hard enough, could convince the Russians that certain things were in their interests, whether that's their outlooks on Europe, their views of their neighbors, their views of their role in the international system, their ability to cooperate with us on common interests. And that's what I think this maybe gets to the second question, which is when was the turning point? When was this seen as inevitable? I don't actually think it was during the Obama administration. I think that we'll look back and reflect on this further, was the Obama administration, had it happened earlier and we just didn't know it yet, right? And that the Medvedev period, the reset period, was this temporary phase where the stars had aligned in the right way, and that issue set, that discrete issue set that Hal talked about emerged, that we were able to get some work done in 2 or 3 years, but that was just a brief moment. And that the seeds it was certainly when Putin came to power in the late 90s, early 2000s, perhaps certainly the Iraq War, the confluence of the Iraq War, Orange Revolutions, missile defense, a whole lot of issues mixed together, probably planted the seeds for this, and I would argue the early 2000s. But then this gets to what we could have done differently. Although I have a lot of issues, as you know, with Bush 43's foreign policy, I don't blame the Bush administration for creating this problem. I think it's a problem that rests principally within Russia. There are tactical things, well, when I say tactical, not fighting the Libya war would have been a big decision. I don't think that would have prevented us from being in the place we are today. Because I think that, and this gets back to the fundamental point that Hal made, his first point, which is we have divergent worldviews, right? If you think about Putin's goals, weak Europe, an EU that's weakened or goes away, NATO that's weak, a transatlantic alliance that isn't strong, a sphere of influence, being a great power, being dominant on the energy markets, and you look at our goals, strong EU, strong transatlantic relationship, strong NATO, energy diversity, democracy, I see very little space for cooperation given those divergent goals.
Alan.
So I think there's a semantic issue that frames substantive conclusions here, and it's our use of the word relations instead of relationship. I think if we use the word relationship consistently instead of relations, we would see this issue through a very different analytical prism, all right? So if we just use that word, it answers your question. It's impossible that only one party can be mainly or exclusively responsible for the denouement all right, in such a complex relationship over time. Now, if we take Ukraine, clearly Russia bears enormous responsibility in the sense that it never really came to terms with the reality of Ukrainian sovereignty, right? And this was repeatedly expressed. Putin tells Bush, you know, George, it's not really a country. You know, most of it's ours. The rest belongs to Europe. Who drew these borders, all right? In effect, it's not unlike U.S. policy toward Cuba for 6 decades in the 20th century. And in the process, Putin is generating, by the way, for the first time, a mass-based Russophobic nationalism in Ukraine, and he may go down in history as the greatest state builder in Ukrainian history, all right? Even though it may be a little smaller than the borders inherited in 1991. I mean, the U.S. bears its part because this lack of focus, this asymmetry in focus meant there was never an incentive for the Americans to sit down with the Russians and the Ukrainians and start thinking, okay, what's the kind of relationship we want in the future? Where does Ukraine fit into this? How do we develop a relationship, a series of relationships where Ukraine's choice for the West doesn't imply a choice against Russia and vice versa? And we never did that. We only became involved, so far as I can tell, once things blew up in Maidan Square. All right, we were leaving it to the EU before that. All right, when did it become inevitable? It became inevitable when the Russians concluded that they could not identify limits to American ambitions, all right? And I think they came to that conclusion on a series of issues over time, beginning with the Kosovo War in 1999. I think Putin believed his ability to defeat large-scale organized Chechen insurgency partly answered that question. Russia at least could defend its interests along its immediate borderlands. The Iraq War, however, raised it again. The U.S. was determined to go outside that venue where the Russians had a legal veto. Where were the limits? I think in the Bucharest Conference of 2008, Ukraine and Georgia are on the list of future NATO admissions. Where are the limits? You have the war. It's the first war against NATO expansion. I recall in China, in 2011, Sergei Karaganov was there, and he really shocked his Chinese hosts when he said, thank God for the Russian-Georgian war. Long pause, because it means there won't be a Russian-Ukraine war, all right? So it became inevitable, I think, when the Russians concluded they couldn't identify limits to American ambitions in a series of areas. Alternatives to U.S. policy, if I identified one, where there were alternatives discussed, it would be the Bucharest Summit of April 2008, where the Germans and the French were strongly opposed to putting Ukraine and Georgia on the list of future NATO states. There was a compromise that effectively achieved the worst of both worlds. You put them up there and you provoke the Russians without any way of actually implementing it. Yeah. Containment light, exactly as Eugene said. Containment light, all right? So coming back to relationships, right? I'm reminded of George Kennan's 52 article in Foreign Affairs, America and the Russian Future. It's the only systematic article I know of where an America is thinking about what might a post-Soviet Russian-American relationship look like. And he said 3 conditions have to be met. Number 1, Russia has to renounce communism. Number 2, it has to renounce totalitarianism because it requires the image of a hostile world to justify its internal power. And 3, it must renounce empire, by which he meant ruling people who were capable of ruling themselves and didn't want to be ruled by you. Well, by those 3 criteria, those apply to Putin's Russia, to the present day, right? I think back, a thought experiment. In 1984, how much would the United States have paid to get the Russia of Putin in 2017? A lot. So I come back to a point Harry Truman made at the Potsdam Conference in 1945, talking to his cronies. He said, I don't expect 100%. I got it from Mel's book. I don't expect 100%, but I do expect 85%, all right? And I think in the post-war world, it could be said the United States expected a lot more than 85% on most occasions, and I think the Russians concluded they didn't know where that line was.
Okay. So, on your first question, I mean, I tend to incline toward the third alternative which you propose, which is that this is more a story of tragedy more than anything else, just in the sense that I don't say this to whitewash aspects of U.S. behavior that certainly provoked and annoyed and threatened the Russians, and you can come up with the whole list, everything from NATO enlargement to Kosovo to the Iraq War to Georgia and Ukraine, in 2004, 2005, so on and so forth. But I think you have to run the counterfactual and ask, does anybody really believe that Russia would not have acted in a revisionist way 20 years after the Cold War, that it would not have tried to become a dominant influence on its near abroad, absent NATO enlargement, absent the Kosovo War? I mean, that requires overlooking a whole lot of tendencies that seem deeply ingrained in Russia's historical behavior and geopolitical situation. And so I tend to think that what's emerged today is simply you have a relatively deep-rooted conflict between countries with very different worldviews and styles of government. And so that leads me to the second point, which is that I think I don't want to say that the confrontation was inevitable, but there was a strong path dependency from the point at which two things became clear. One, it became clear that the United States was not going to afford Russia the deference that Russia wanted, particularly in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space that the Russians wanted, which was clear, I think, as early as the late 1990s. And this was also, I think, the time that the second thing became clear, which is that Russian democratization was not going to succeed. And once you had those two pillars in place, it just becomes very hard to get events off of a bad trajectory. And there were certainly things that could have been done differently. There were certainly choices that mattered. We flagged a number of them. But after that point, it becomes hard to see how you avoid this. So that gets to the third question. Were there policies that we should have pursued in different ways or done differently? I think Alan is exactly right about basically the Bucharest summit and the very kind of ambiguous compromise that comes out about Georgia and Ukraine, which serves to provoke but not defend. You could ask, if we were going to do it over again, would we really want to give Latvia a security guarantee? I mean, I think these are legitimate questions to ask, but on the big issues, I wouldn't undo NATO expansion, because I think there's been a lot of good that's come out of that as well. There are other policies I wish we hadn't pursued, but not because of their impact on U.S. Russia relations, Libya being the perfect example of this. So I think it's a good question to ask, and we should always go back and think about what policies we might have pursued more prudently or more wisely. But I think that the structural forces leading us to where we are today were so strong that it's hard to identify a single turning point or two that would have made a decisive difference.
Gene?
So Hal's number one, Alan's number three, and so on. I can almost repeat this. Look, I think Hal just put it very well. And before that, others, Arnie, for example, when did it become inevitable? Late 19th century, right? Who bears the responsibility? Well, the system, I think. Again, you just heard very persuasively. I don't need to repeat that. If I had to kind of narrow it down to the period of the last 25 years, I would say that, Eric, all of these events have been building up to some kind of denouement. If I had to single out one event, I would say that it was the invitation in principle to Georgia in NATO, the Bucharest summit. Yeah. Although, again, I just want to make very clear, I think NATO expansion was a remarkable success. It transformed Eastern Europe. Who knows what it would have been like after the end of the Warsaw Pact, and no disrespect to these countries, but if they had been left unmoored, I don't know what would have happened there. Some of it, actually, we're already seeing now in some of the countries in Poland and Hungary, and so on. So real alternatives, again, going back to what I said in the beginning, I think this is sort of the natural state, although I disagree with Derek in that there are no areas where our interests coincide. We need Russia. It's not, well, I'd put aside the question of interest, but I think we'll need Russia in many areas. We'll need Russia again on Afghanistan, well, depending on what we decide to do. We can't settle again, as Alan said, Ukraine without it. There are lots of things that Russia will be essential to our ability to accomplish something there. So,
Okay, thank you, and thanks to all the panelists for being as disciplined as they were about answering that. Bob, and then Philip.
Well, excellent panel. Three quick questions. Three quick questions. Derek, this one may be for you, but given the what I think is the danger of Russian intervention in our election process, which I think goes to really a core interest of the United States, why doesn't President Obama respond more vigorously? Then the other two questions are planting seeds for perhaps future relations with Russia. And the one is on the economic side. We discussed yesterday how the economic trauma undermined Gorbachev and then the events of the 90s. There is a revival here, and the people such as Kudrin and Greff actually do a reasonable job with Russia's economy. And there was a period when I was at the World Bank where we had a lot of cooperative relations with Russia on a whole series of items. And so this is more for the Russia specialists. What happened to that? And are there prospects where there may be a revival? If not, Russia's economy, as Professor Lynch mentioned, continues to shrink. Again, I even think today their macroeconomic performance is reasonably professional. The problem is on the microeconomic side. So as we look to the future, might there be a turn in Russia when a new generation of economic reformers drives it? And then the last question is, understandably, we spend much of our time on sort of Russia's perspective of the West that goes back centuries. But again, for Russian specialists, when do you think, if ever, that the Russian strategic community will kind of get beyond the 19th century and 20th century conflicts with the West and recognize that their position in Eurasia is threatened much more by China and the areas to the south? So we had discussion about the American behavior in Central Asia. Well, I don't think we're doing very much there, but the Chinese certainly are. So looking to the future again, and this may be the effect of sort of the Trump policies, ironically, since it was the liberal international order that Russia didn't like that we were advancing, well, maybe now we're not advancing it, and maybe we're actually taking it apart. So we may have an opportunity here to return to sort of great power maneuvering, which may serve Russia fine. So I wouldn't advise this, but nevertheless, it may be what we encounter. And in that world, the Russian perception of, I understand all the historical posits about NATO. I've sat through endless discussions of this. But do Russians really believe that NATO is more threatening to them than issues to their east and south?
Philip, does it make sense to take your question now, or do you want to hold off and hear the answers to these and then pose your question?
Better to hear this first.
Okay.
Because I'll shift the direction. This is interesting.
Okay, fair enough.
You want me to take the election?
Derek, why don't you take the election, and then maybe Gene and Alan, you can take the economy, and the two of you maybe can address the Russian strategic community as well.
So Bob, great question. And it's something I know I was just talking the other day with former colleagues who were on the Clinton campaign who were asking themselves this question as well. And I think there's a variety of answers to it. I mean, I think first, as I said in my opening, I think there was, although the administration was certainly aware of what was going on, and we were seeing it publicly play out with Podesta's emails and all that, that the scope of it was the administration was catching up to actually what was happening. So there was, in retrospect, it seems like a much clearer case than it did at the time. That's number one. Number two, I think, I know that the Obama administration to the extent it wanted to raise awareness on this, it wanted to do so in a way that it did not look as though it was trying to intervene in the election, right, on behalf of Secretary Clinton. So, of course, reached out to leadership on the Hill to have some sort of joint statement that they could release, and folks on the Hill, the Republicans on the Hill, were not interested in that. Now, I think that gets into another story about kind of how the politics of this and how Certainly, many Republicans for a long time were very slow to acknowledging this as even an issue. Of course, now we have a president who still questions whether it is an issue. And I think this gets to the third reason, which is I think Obama, and just like everybody else, thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win. So thought, why do I want to give this issue to Donald Trump, who, let's remember, is contesting the election he won, right? I mean, he says 3 million people voted illegally. So I think Obama quite fairly was playing this out and thinking, well, if she's going to win and this guy's going to contest it, why would I give him a further reason to do it if I don't think it's going to tip the scales? And as I said, they were also very focused on the security of the voting machines, but not on the social media aspect of it, what we have been so focused on recently. And the one thing I don't know, because I wasn't in government at the time, if I was, I couldn't talk about it, but I don't know what was considered in terms of the brushback pitches. That's what I don't know. I mean, I think my sense is, knowing from past discussions in the administration on different issues, is that the president would be probably asking a lot of questions about escalation. And okay, so if we do this to them, then what are they going to do back at us? And are we just in this dynamic that is going to end in a very bad place? And if she's going to win anyway, let's let this happen, and then we'll meaning let the election go forward, and then we'll sort this out in 2017, or the Clinton administration will sort this out.
Alan, you want to?
On this, but first of all, I see somebody's wallet under a chair there, so just to note that. I'm colorblind, but not black on blue. So I think the pitch has been delivered, actually. I think the brushback pitch, the chin music, has been delivered to the Russians. You recall back in early mid-October, Biden said, we will, in effect, strike back at a time, place, and manner of our choosing, and in such a way that it will be undeniable to the Russians what's happening. At the end of October, all right, all of a sudden, in Kiev, was published a treasure trove, whole archives from Vladislav Surkov's office, Putin's right-hand man on Ukraine policy, okay? And it demonstrates in chapter and verse Russia's role in the instigation, reinforcement, escalation of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. It was published in 5 European languages, in perfect English. That was it. The Russians got the message.
Gene, do you and Alan want to take on the question of the revival and at what moment the Russian strategic community will finally come to the conclusion that so many of us have reached since 1993 that they have more to fear from China and their southern border than they do from NATO, which I would like to point out did not have, I mean, the United States anyway, did not have a single tank in Europe in the NATO arsenal at the time of the invasion of Crimea.
Just, if I may, to add to what Alan said, regardless of what we did or didn't do to punish the Russians, they're convinced, I think they're convinced, I can't prove it, but based on sort of my reading of the tea leaves, that, for example, the publication of the doping violations and Panama Papers were the handiwork of Western security services intended to embarrass them. So whatever we may or may not have done, they think that we had a hand in it. I think, in a sense, on the question of, will there be a new generation of progressive economists in Russia someday who will really make a difference? I think you answered it. The macro picture is okay, but the micro picture is where the problem is. And then it's not only a question of, it is a question of rule of law and transparency and, taking on the, it's not a question of economics, I see it, more of a question of politics. When you take on the oligarchic structure of the Russian economy, the people around the Kremlin who really have captured the commanding heights. So when will that happen? It's very hard to predict. I mean, there is this gentleman by the name of Navalny, who is mounting a very impressive political campaign on the theme of anti-corruption. I honestly don't know quite what to make of him, because despite constant harassment and physical attacks on him, he's been able to establish a very impressive campaign organization in dozens, I think about 100, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, Russian cities. And when you look at videos from his meetings, these are young people with, really a full appreciation that if they attend this meeting, they could lose their jobs, they could be kicked out of school, their families who have been punished, yet there's something there. So this may be a hopeful development that could, at the political level, begin to address the problem. The question of whether or not it will be sufficient to take on the structure of the Russian, I guess, political economy, really, that's an open question. On China, I actually disagree with, there are a couple of comments made yesterday, and Eric, you just made the point again, that China poses a greater threat to Russia than the West. There's an interesting argument taking hold in the Russian strategic community, voiced first, as far as I know, very prominently by Foreign Minister Lavrov in an article in 2016, maybe early 2017, easy to find, it's in Russia and Global Affairs, in which he argues that the West really has always been much more intrusive in Russia's domestic life, and that the Mongols actually were much more tolerant, leaving Russia be and pursue its own domestic arrangements. So and amazingly, this argument is beginning to take hold, in that I heard a highly respected Russian colleague say that, well, key to Russian state building has been this ability to withstand the Mongol yoke. So, whereas the West wants our soul, and will never accept that. And I do.
The Poles say about the Russians.
Well, and the Russians cite the Poles as having been garrisoned in the Kremlin as. So I think I think the Russian strategic community fully understands the challenge that Russia poses, but their answer to it is twofold. One, China does not require the kind of domestic adjustment inside Russia that the West requires in order to have a good relationship with it. Two, China is so big and so potentially threatening that Russia has no choice but to, I'll pardon the expression, but to keep it in the bear hug, as close as you can. Keep your enemies closer. So there's an element, perhaps, of strategic wisdom. Where I don't understand Russian foreign policy is not just with respect to China, but with respect to Japan, for example. They have a terrific opportunity to develop some balancing relationships in the Asia-Pacific theater, yet they constantly continue to stick it to the Japanese and other Asian nations. Once again, they miss a major opportunity. I don't know if anybody's asking that question there.
Alan, I want to hear what Philip says. I'll be really quick. Whatever threat China might pose is longer term, right? But if Ukraine begins to be integrated into NATO's operational military machinery, there's a 300-mile distance between the northeast border of Ukraine and Moscow across featureless steppe. And if I'm a Russian military planner, I don't know how I start developing, contingency planning under those circumstances. So it's a very different time scale and intensity of potential worst-case scenario we're talking about. On Bob Zellick's point on the economy, I take that fully. There's been very competent macroeconomic management at lower and lower overall levels of performance in the economy, right? So on the one hand, what you see is that after the global crisis of 2008, the Russian economy, first of all, moves 15 points down in GDP growth in 12 months, from 7 to 8 plus to 7 to 8 minus. Even the Saudis grew 1% in that period of time. And they're twice as dependent or more, as the Russians are, on petroleum. So there's something fundamentally amiss there, right? When the Russians recovered They didn't recover to 7 or 8%. They recovered to 3 to 4% growth, and then it began to decline each year down to 0 at the end of 2013, before the outbreak of the Ukraine crisis, and while oil was $110 a barrel. That tells me the system has now exhausted the residual economic infrastructure inherited from the Soviet Union, temporarily rejuvenated by American drilling technology, all right? In effect, a major crisis of productivity throughout the economy, not unlike the Brezhnev period in the mid to late 1970s. But there's a double whammy. It's political. And that is, the very strength of Putin's system is also its weakness, right? Highly centralized, non-transparent, corrupt, crony-based, clan-based. Also not unlike the succession problem in the mid to late 1970s in the Soviet Union, where Brezhnev was basically kept on almost 10 years too long, right? If we extend that to 1985. So, yes, you have competent economists who are managing the current system, who would prefer to be managing a little different system, but you've now got the prospect with Putin's re-election. He's aware of the problems, by the way, in both of these areas. The problem is he's got to dismantle the system he spent 16 years building. And therefore, the longer he waits, the more it's going to resemble the Gorbachev problem, having to simultaneously reform the political and economic systems, which suggests, by the way, that our colleague Dmitry Trenin might not be so wrong when he concludes his book, Should We Fear Russia? Maybe the thing we really need to fear is Russian weakness as opposed to Russian strength.
Philip.
That was really excellent. Thank you. I wanted to shift the subject a little bit. I'm struck by how little we've said about the Bush 43 years. There is a little reference to some references to the Bucharest Summit of 08 and glancing references to a war with Georgia in 08. Really, of all the administrations since 1917, in a way, other than maybe the Harding administration, we've said less about the Johnson and Bush 43 era. And I think we can pass the Johnson administration pretty readily. The Bush 43 period, I think back on Eric's question, that's potentially a very interesting period. And you do have this extraordinary phenomenon where you have someone who was a professional Soviet expert who is the national security advisor and then the Secretary of State. That's unusual. It's unique, I believe. Yet, my impression from the period in which I was in a good position to watch this sort of closely was that the American agenda with Russia was nearly empty. During some, for reasons we can understand and explain, but on reflection, I think this is worth some analysis. Was America, in other words, was there a lost period of 8 years in which 9/11 and the post 9/11 exacts yet more opportunity costs, more loss of focus, as Alan would put it, in ways that we had not yet begun to calculate?
I think that's probably a question for me. Yeah. Philip, is a good question. You know, when you think back to the beginning of the Bush administration, it on U.S. Russia relations did not begin very auspiciously, as you will recall. It began with the expulsion of 50 Russian diplomats for activities inconsistent with their diplomatic status, as we like to say. You know, it was the first, you know, in the first 6 months, there was, as I think has been, you know, consistent, you know, going back to Harry Truman, a kind of interest in having a new administration, some product differentiation from its predecessor, and a bit of a reset. of the relationship. I mean, I think there was a sense in the incoming team, first of all, that the Clinton administration had excessively personalized the relationship between Clinton and Yeltsin. There was, I mean, Putin had only been in office for about a year, so I think for many of the people, including people in the administration who'd had a lot of experience in earlier parts of their life, in Soviet affairs, including Condi, later on, including Bob Gates, myself. I mean, I think it was a question mark, who Putin was and what he was going to mean. The first meeting between the two presidents in Slovenia led to, for me anyway, one of the more cringeworthy moments in the entire Bush presidency, which was the president's comment that he'd looked into Putin's soul and seen a guy who he could work with. I do think the president thought that he could work effectively with Putin. We talked a little bit about personality yesterday and the role it plays and the contingent role it plays. It struck me a lot during those 8 years that the fact that the president of Russia and the defense minister for most of the time that I was in government were both KGB case officers, and that they were case officering their counterparts, which is to say these are people whose entire professional training was to try and identify the personality characteristics of their interlocutors, their strengths and weaknesses, and to try and turn those weaknesses into advantage for them, for the Soviet Union when it was the KGB, but for Russia under the Putin-Lavrov administration. And I remember having several conversations with Secretary Rumsfeld where he would report that Sergei Ivanov had said this or that about cooperative missile defense, and meanwhile, I and my colleagues were, busy beavering away trying to do something cooperative on missile defense, in which our Russian interlocutors showed zero interest. I mean, and I agree with Derek on this. There was no interest in pursuing this. I mean, from 2007 to 2008, after the missile defense decision made, we give 5 non-papers to the Russians with different proposals of how they can monitor the missiles in Poland to make sure that they're not a problem. We go to great lengths to explain the physical properties of the interceptors and why they can't intercept Russian ICBMs because they're based too closely to the launch points, so you'd be in a tail chase. And no matter how much we explained this to Ivanov and Baluyevsky, they had no interest in pursuing common missile test beds, all sorts of things that we offered. We never even got a response. And same with CFE, by the way. After they pull out of CFE or suspend their participation in CFE in 2007, we spend the better part of 2 years. My former colleague Dan Freed, another Cornellian, by the way, turned himself into a pretzel, coming up with new ways to try and scratch the Russian itch on CFE. And there's nothing we can propose that would do it. But I would talk to Rumsfeld about Sergei Ivanov and he would say, but they're so interested in doing something jointly. Why can't you guys, succeed? And I said, sir, he's a case officer. He's case officering you. And Rumsfeld would say, you mean he's lying to me? I said, I know that, But there was this sense, I think, to some degree that our leaders were being played by Russian leadership who were trying to encourage them to believe that there was something that could be done, when I don't think there was really much interest on the Russian side in doing things in common. And I do think you then get this sort of, I think the Iraq War has less to do with it. I think, for me, it's the Orange Revolution in 2004 that is the real turning point, because that convinces Putin that we are coming after him, that whatever we say and do, we are coming after him. I think it explains a lot of what follows, including Syria, because I think he sees when the Arab spring starts, he sees that as just one more color revolution, sponsored by the Americans, whose ultimate aim is him and removing him from office. So, I mean, you're right, there's a lot in that. I mean, the whole 2008 thing in Bucharest, I agree with my colleagues that was, that is one where I think we could have done something different. It was probably too heavy a lift in the last, 6 months of a presidential administration to take on the Germans and the French, who were dead set against this at a NATO summit, and to try and fight that fight. I mean, Bob Gates and I both were, not in favor of it, but we were overruled, and I think it was more an ideological predisposition. That Europe whole and free, anyone who wants to be part of NATO and can meet the terms should be allowed in, and I think that was a.
Was opposed?
Let me put it this way: Bob and I talked about it and raised innumerable questions in the Principals Committee meeting about this. How is this really going to work? How easy is this? Could we not come up with something else? Instead, I mean, for those who don't remember this, the debate was over whether to provide the Membership Action Plan, MAP status to Ukraine and Georgia. No country that had received MAP status had not become a NATO member. So for many people, the debate was, this is tantamount to offering them NATO membership.
Mary, forgive me, had not become a member within a short period of time.
Within a short period of time. And so, and Bob and I both agreed, I mean, Ukraine wasn't even asking for membership at this point. And Georgia clearly wasn't ready for it, whether they wanted it or not. There was an enormous disposition to, be positive with the Georgians, because the Georgians had been extraordinarily helpful in Iraq, for instance. I mean, we had to then evacuate Afghanistan, and we had to evacuate the Georgian troops in Iraq to get them back to Georgia in 2008, which was, actually quite a big lift. And so, and we go into Bucharest, and we end up with, the Germans and the French saying, absolutely not, we're not going to give them MAP. That would be tantamount to making them members. And then we come up with a compromise that says, Georgia and Ukraine don't get MAP, but someday they will become members of NATO. And it's very odd, because you get this sort of 24-hour period where the Russians are all doing the happy dance because they think they've stopped NATO from giving MAP to Georgia and Ukraine, until they actually read the full communique and realize that it's worse. That, we've actually said, they're going to be members. And I mean, I agree with Alan, I think, who said that this was the worst of all worlds, because we've actually.
Was Condi driving this? Or who was driving it?
Yeah, who was arguing it was going to work?
Our U.S. ambassador to NATO was driving it very heavily. She believed very strongly that we should do this. The State Department was, by and large, driving this. I mean, Condi was certainly supportive. I'm sorry, Strobe.
Just because you referenced the sort of arid non-conversation with the Russians on getting arms control back, triggered my thought that there is actually in the, let's call it the LBJ lacuna, a very important summit, which was Glassboro.
Right.
And MAD and ABM, and if Mel and Will and the authors can get that in at some point, I think it's important.
We had a very interesting conversation. I had a very interesting conversation at one point with then Deputy Foreign Minister, later Ambassador and alleged spy master Sergei Kislyak, about the suspension of CFE. And I said to him, I've read the treaty, and under what provision of the treaty are you suspending your participation? Because as I read the treaty, there's actually provision for leaving the treaty, but there's nothing in the treaty that says you can stay in the treaty and suspend your participation. So what's the legal case here for what you're doing? And his response was really interesting. He said, well, since the treaty allows for withdrawal, obviously it must allow for lesser measures, that would allow you not to, fulfill your obligations. And I said, that's a really interesting theory. I wish we'd been clever enough to think about that in the ABM context, because I could have, gotten back a whole lot of time in my life that I'm never going to get back, that we spent fighting over this, when we were talking about, getting out of the ABM treaty. Strobe could have saved a lot of time, too, in 1999 and 2000. Vlad.
Well, there's a terrific panel and a rare chance, really, to get some feedback on what happened. But we are here to discuss what to do. And unfortunately, on this question, the panel gave a very unsatisfactory answer. We should wait until it gets worse before it gets better, says one distinguished panelist. And we're stuck.
Very, very Leninist.
We're stuck, said another panelist. I should correct the record, by the way. Eugen said that such a discussion is impossible in Russia. Perhaps today, but back in 1999, I remember a fantastic conference with all the so-called hardliners, those who failed in August coup, and American political science masterminds, getting together in Moscow and discussing exactly that in the context of the 90s, what went wrong, what were American intentions. So I would say that this junction is that the Russians began this sort of conversation 20 years earlier. And Americans refused to have this conversation until we got stuck. I remember I sat next to one I wouldn't name him, a Russian diplomat in Washington, and Condi Rice came and gave a talk, something about, the 90s took a hard toll on the Russian people, and that Russian diplomat turned to me as if, we met the first time I was a Russian, and said, oh, finally, he at least admits that. So it was very belated that Americans came to grasp that something was actually going wrong systemically in the conversation. So now when we stuck, the obvious question, should we perhaps move to another type of a discussion? During the Cold War, the last phase of the Cold War, Robert Osgood coined the term graduated tension reduction of international relations. Great. I remember, I'm old enough to remember how we discussed it to the wee hours. So maybe we should come up with some practical lessons how to do this grit stuff. Now, I have one suggestion, an obvious suggestion, a Truth and Reconciliation Committee consisting of some of the present distinguished experts and some Russians like Karaganov, because Karaganov, back in 1992, as well as many Russian liberals, who were not blameless, of course. I mean, they were Russian to begin with, so inherently imperialistic. But that imperialistic gene could be contained in a different way rather than expanding NATO right away in expectation that sooner or later Russia would become Russia again. They expected that the West would support Russia in its earnest desire to be a democratic, liberal, reformist leader in its neighborhood, vis-à-vis Ukraine, vis-à-vis Central Asia, vis-à-vis other countries. Another myth, perhaps, but very early, the Karaganovs and other types noticed that the United States does not want to allow them to be such a leader, even on democratic terms. And that was the beginning of the change of mind when the same people began to use another expression, near broad, liberal empire, and so on and so forth. So that actually began surprisingly early, around 1993, 1994. So because, we lacked such an opportunity, such a setting between the Russians and the Americans, we couldn't even compare the timelines. I tell my students, start your paper with a timeline. It will reveal your biases. It will help you to deal with other competing points of view. We've never done it. So that's the first thing I would suggest. But I would be interested in your opinions. What other great measures we should come up with?
Hal, you want to?
Well, I would just say, I actually don't think this is the first time we've had this type of searching discussion about what's gone wrong in U.S. Russia relations. I think there was the whole who lost Russia debate at the end of the 1990s, which was in many ways unfair, but it was asking precisely this. There was a similar debate at the end of the Bush administration. What had gone wrong in U.S. Russia relations leading to the Georgia War? And the outcome of that debate was the reset policy. So I guess I would disagree a little bit with the premise here. With respect to another thing that was mentioned, if we could have been sure that Russia was going to lead its neighborhood on the basis of Russian democratization, that would have been one thing. But what was basically being asked is, give us a veto on the geopolitical alignments of our neighbors now, and maybe democratization will succeed at some point in the future. But U.S. policymakers had to consider, what do we do if Russian democratization fails? And so they had to hedge against that possibility as well. In terms of grit today, I'm all for carving out areas of cooperation where that can be productive. I think the problem is that in the areas where it is clear that there is a critical Russian role to play in solving the problem, the U.S. and Russian interests are just so sharply in conflict that it's hard to know what the grit measure would be, and Ukraine would be the obvious example here. I think there are other issues where, there's potentially some aspect, they can do tension management, which is essentially what we've been doing in Syria, and I think that should continue. But the cupboard is relatively bare in terms of issues where there's a prospect for significant cooperation. So it's just hard for me to kind of identify where you go and what you do.
It strikes me that I recall in terms of what Hal just talked about, I think there were periods when we've had all sorts of debates and soul searching in the U.S. about, what went wrong and how did it go wrong. I remember distinctly in September of 2008, testifying with Dan Freed and Fiona Hill in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee about the Georgia War. And to Derek's point that the Obama administration came in with the sense that there'd been this, as he put it very euphemistically, scar tissue that had built up in the U.S.-Russian relationship. I remember being questioned quite closely by then Senator Clinton in that hearing in a way that suggested that she was convinced that the Georgia War had been, and I'm extrapolating a little bit from what she said, and not much though, was basically kind of provoked by the Bush administration as a kind of ploy to try and elect John McCain in 2008. If only we had been that, that clever in the Bush administration, and by August and September of 2008, we were thoroughly exhausted and could barely get through our day. I think both Bob and Philip had had the good sense to leave by then. But so we did have these kind of debates about, I think there was a disposition in part of the Obama administration, you can correct me if I'm wrong, to say, oh, look, Bush did all these things, the Georgia, Ukraine, Bucharest, the missile defense, all that. This provoked it. We can fix this. And then I think they ran into, because I think there was much more continuity than either administration would allow publicly between the two policies, you ran into a lot of the same problems we did. The Russians weren't interested in working on a lot of these problems, as I was suggesting. Part of the discussion yesterday, and Derek and I had a kind of discussion after dinner last night, I'm thinking back to Svetlana and Strobe's discussion yesterday. Part of what happened, I think, the kind of misprision between the two sides after 1992 was when we Americans would go to Russians and say, what is it that you want? What is it that you're looking for? The answer would come back, we want to be a normal country. And our response was, well, if you want to be a normal country, that means you need to be at peace with your neighbors and not trying to rule them, and you need to have a market economy and all of that. But as Eastern Europeans used to say in those days, it's much easier to say you should have a market economy than actually do it, because as the old joke used to go, we know how to turn an aquarium into fish soup, but we don't know how to turn fish soup into an aquarium. So it was almost, I think, inevitable that we would have this kind of misreading.
Could I say something?
Yes, please, Gene, and then I want to go to Frank Castigliola, and I think then we have to wrap up.
Just to address Vlad Zubov's point, I think, you ask a fair question. If you put aside the question of the utter implosion that occurred in Russia after 1991, I don't think Russia was really capable of doing anything that at the time Russian security analysts were proposing, including Karaganov. So, I mean, you had, and I want to reiterate that, I think NATO enlargement, up until 2008, was a remarkable success. There's just, it's implausible, it's impossible to think that, everything in Europe, in European affairs, should have been put on hold, and everybody should have waited until Russia would get its act together. I just don't think it's a realistic proposition. And if I just may, to Phil Zeliko's question, I think, as Eric suggested too, it's a question for you. I mean, you were in the administration at the time. I remember early on there was an attempted dialogue at Energy Partnership. There was a long and drawn-out conversation about having Russia join the WTO. So it wasn't exactly an empty agenda, but it didn't produce a whole lot. It's true, but there were sort of these efforts to build, to get a buy-in from both sides.
This is very much of an historical footnote to a discussion which is focused on the present and on the future. But I want to go back to, I can't help but go back to Hal Brands' quote of George Kennan. Kennan saying that something to the effect that a little bit of military force helps make diplomacy more pleasant. Is that the quote? And of course, you were talking about that in terms of military force on the periphery of Russia in the territory of the former Soviet Union. I think it's important, just to be fair to Kennan, to look at the historical context when he made that remark. He made it on September 16th, 1946. Right. It was in the Q&A after his first lecture at the National War College. Right. And Kennan made it in the context at a time when the United States was rapidly drawing down its military forces after World War II. And he made it in the context of actually the dispute over Trieste, and referring to the fact that it was good that there was a certain amount of American naval force and military force in Italy at that time. I think that, just to be fair to Kennan and Kennan's memory, I think he would be very much opposed, and not think the military force would make the diplomacy more pleasant, be very much opposed to deploying American military force on the territory of the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, to be fair, I was not making that in the context of the deployment of military force on the territory of the Soviet Union, although I do favor enhanced forward presence in the Baltic. But I think the point with which Kennan would not disagree, even though he would vigorously contest all of the assessments that we provided here, was that without leverage, which often comes in the form of strength and military force, diplomacy cannot hope to succeed.
Sure, but he also believed that it was important to respect the Russian sense of their propriety and what they had coming to them as a great power.
He was also insistent on making the distinction between what Graham Allison has called, he was recently here, vital interests, and let's call them vested interests.
All right, with that, I want to thank the panelists for a very stimulating conversation.